Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi and I am making today's video because very recently I came across a fellow player on one of the many Magic social groups that I'm in who was absolutely losing their mind over all the, and I quote, hidden cards now in Standard that there's no way to get other than using Wildcards, and how this was a huge conspiracy for Wizards of the Coast to make us use all of our wild cards. And, well, yes, he's not entirely wrong. There are cards now in Standard that currently the only way to get them is by using wild cards. And yes, I'm sure that that is part of Wizards of the Coast strategy and how they are being presented and what we must do to unlock them. But the reality is there's not really that much to worry about, and today I want to take a little bit of time, go through these and make some recommendations of which cards are for who, and well, some of them just aren't. But before we get into all that, I'm sure you know that the 5-year foundation set in Standard is going to change a lot of things, not just in Standard, but in particular for budget and free-to-play players. What you may not know is you can make a big impact around here by making a funding choice through our Patreon, whether you're just helping keep the lights on every month, or you're making contributions towards specific content or hardware upgrades. Just know all the Patreon funding goes back into the community. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Let's start this conversation with a little bit of reflection. When I did my Budget Shop Talk video at the beginning of the season, or really the preseason, I cautioned folks about not crafting any of these cards until we had a really good idea of what was going to be in the expected change to the starter decks. And then they immediately went and gave us previews of all of the starter decks to basically answer all of our questions. Well, in all honesty, probably not all of them. These decks, of course, are subject to change, but we do have a pretty good idea of what's going on. And that's why in this video I am going to be avoiding cards that are specifically in these starter decks because, well, you already know they exist. And for the large part, I will also be avoiding those higher rarities, rare or mythic possibilities, because those are the ones that are most likely to change and potentially impact us and our wild cards. It's also fairly noteworthy that if you are a long-time Arena player like me, a lot of these cards are Arena reprints, so you might be sitting pretty. But make sure before you make a craft decision that you check and see what you already have, because if you are using Arena's set filter, it's not going to show you copies that you might have from other sets. This is probably also a good time to get some of the heavy lifting out of the way, the large group of cards that, well, are almost like talking about one card. First of which, of course, is the Gates package. This is a collection of about 15 mostly commons and uncommons that have a highly synergistic effect that revolve around the Gate lands. Hopefully none of this is much of a surprise. I actually talked about one of these decks in our very first midweek Magic event, where I laid out 3 decks built exclusively around Foundations cards. The other large group to talk about, of course, is the Temple lands, the rare 2-color dual lands that are, well, almost permanently in Standard in my mind, at least for the next 5+ years. While I certainly don't normally recommend crafting rare dual lands, this long-term nature of these cards do make them a better choice than others. And before we get going in a Wooburg style fashion, just a couple reminders here in order to save time in the video. I'm not going to be covering anything that are in the starter deck previews, any cards that I otherwise know are currently in your collection or available in Standard. And I also will not be spending time on cards that are really just best of 3 sideboard cards. those of you who play those formats are going to know about those anyway. And once again, I am avoiding rares that might shift between the previews of the starters and the final versions that the Arena team begins to give out to new players. But if you have any specific questions about any cards from any of those categories, drop them down in the comments and I'll be happy to address them individually. Starting things off in white, we've got 3 common cards with somewhat obvious typal kindred implications. Obviously, cats, soldiers, vampires, all in the mix. And let's not forget, we are scheduled for a return to Lorwyn in February of 2026. So Kithkin are very likely to become more relevant at that time. And don't overlook the Bishop Soldier's lifelink, making him a very capable 2/2 outside of the vampire or soldier concerns in any of those life gain matters decks. And while we're talking about life gain, I think Linden is worth a little more consideration than a typical rare in this subset. Her triple white nature, along with the fact that there is already a 2-color legendary creature in the life gain starter, I think it's very unlikely that we see a switch up here, and I think Linden is a safer than average rare craft that could pay a lot of dividends in those life gain matters decks, especially the more aggressive semi-mono white versions. You just know blue is going to stay true to its tricksy nature with instances like a Dive Down and creatures like Exclusion Mage in the format. Dive Down, a wonderful little protection spell, giving not only a +3 to the defense, but gains hexproof until end of turn. And Exclusion Mage, when it ETBs, return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. Pretty serious, tricksy things going on here. And if you have any concerns about Hadi Jin rotating out, don't you worry one little bit. Tempest Jin is going to be here to keep that mono blue Jin deck going, well, maybe forever. Oh, what would a black mage be without removal? And Gatekeeper Malakar is here to take care of those pesky indestructible creatures by making the opponent potentially sack it. And of course, Feed Swarm not only deals with creatures, but oddly enough, enchantments. Simply for a little loss of life, and what black mage isn't willing to give up a little life? If you're a red mage, you can have your opponents fuming like never before by using a new to Arena finisher, Ball Lightning, at the top end of your red rush decks. And Gutter Snipe is going to be putting in a ton of work to make mono red burn great again. Impact Trimmers comes back to standard to shake things up, and this is one of those Arena reprints, and there is a wildcard differential here. There is the common version from Foundations, but there's also an uncommon version, so not only be aware of what you have, but craft wisely. And 2 wonderful role fillers return to standard. Seize the Spoils, giving you pseudo card draw and ramp, while Vashino Pyromancer is giving you a body with a shock attached. The Green Mage can positively blossom with cards like Fierce Empath, Finn the Fangbearer, and Imperious Perfect, opening up not only tribal aspects, but a number of beatdown and stompy strategies. Green's Predatory Ooze, of course, piques the interest, but a 3-mana 1/1, even with Indestructible and some upside growth potential, is, well, maybe questionable at this stage. Primal Might, on the other hand, is an absolute staple-worthy card, but be aware this sort of thing has shown up in starter decks before, so if they make an adjustment, this is one of those that's very likely to be in consideration. And last but not least, I've got 3 cards that I think really should be on everyone's craft lists. The first is Boros Charm, and yeah, I know this only goes in Boros decks, and that's not the sort of thing I usually recommend, but have you looked at Standard lately? Every deck is Boros. we've got Boros Aggro, we've got Boros Burn, we've got Boros Angels, and next week I think we're going to have Boros hors d'oeuvres, because Boros is everything recently. Next up, we've got Adaptive Automation, a 3-mana 2/2 Lord for all of your tribal decks that's colorless. I mean, how crazy is that? Everyone should have one of these in their collection, if for no other reason when they play a tribal brawl deck. And in a similar fashion, Maze Mind Tome is a 2-mana artifact that brings card selection, card draw, and eventual life gain to every deck, regardless of color. Everyone should have one of these in their collection. So there it is, guys. Those are my thoughts on this wildcard only subset of foundations. But get down in the comments and let me know, what are you crafting? And before we go, while every member of this community is important to me, I just wanted to take a moment and give a shout out to those patrons providing financial support and keeping the Stronghold from being a complete financial black hole. And of course, let me leave you with some suggestions for your next step here on the channel.